So Owen Benjamin, from what I can tell, has murdered Jordan Peterson. And that's a hyperbolic way of saying that he's trying to abort Jordan Peterson. He's having a Jordan Peterson abortion, and that's another hyperbolic way of saying that he's trying to cut Jordan out of his heart and soul. And so he's trying to murder him with words over and over again. And you might say, well, why do you care what Owen Benjamin says about Jordan Peterson? You know, who are they to you anyway, right? Well, I'm in both of their communities. I follow Jordan, I follow Owen, I follow Paul Vanderklay, so you might be part of his community. And I think it's part of our duty as members of these communities to give feedback when feedback is necessary. Just like Owen did to Jordan Peterson when Jordan did the infamous Kavanaugh tweet. Owen sent out his feedback, and and everybody in his following also gave a little response back to Jordan. And they're giving response back to Owen, trying to correct what they view is perhaps a misstep on his part in his reaction to Jordan Peterson. So there's reverberative waves going on here in the information networks, and I'm just part of that, and so are all of you to some extent or another. So what I want to do here is bring up some criticisms Owen made in this video. I've listened to it twice and outlined the whole video to try to get to the meat of the issue here. And I want to bring in N.T. Wright, who's a notable New Testament scholar and theologian. If you're unfamiliar with him, I do go over him somewhat in some other videos. And so he's going to give some commentary. And I'm going to let Owen speak for himself as well. And I'm going to do some summary just because I don't want to play too much of the video and looking for specific bits that he has said, little quotes, because I might wander around too much. Like I said, I've watched the video twice and I did take some notes, so I'll be working off of the notes. So right here, Owen's going to talk about the shame mobs that went after him and how they tried to destroy his character.
And I just keep seeing special after special on Netflix, just rewarding the liars. And so it just made me dial in and be like, figure out what exactly matters. And I don't care when people tell me that, like, for a while it was like ruin comedian, shame comedian, has been, look at this. I'm like, dude, that was a month ago. I was at CIA. And then when I watched Jordan Peterson sign with CIA, that stung a little because I looked up to him. And then to see him, it depends what you mean by God. It's like, what? Jordan Peterson thinks that everyone should believe in God because it makes for Judeo-Christian values of the West, but he doesn't, though. And he thinks it's complicated. It's a lot like Horace. And then he thinks Judge Kavanaugh should apologize to the mob and step down because it's all very complicated. And that's why when people are like, why don't you just listen to what Peterson has to say in his apology? I'm like, I did. It's nonsense. I've been through this over and over and over again. Once people get power and money, they go insane unless they have a spirituality. I mean, the only atheists that I know that are kind of grounded are the ones that think this is a simulation for some reason, because somehow it still has the unmoved mover principle, or just people who genuinely don't think about stuff like that at all. But these like leftist determinist people, they're nuts, and they don't have your back, and they'll sell you out. They will burn your family out of a town. And a lot of you haven't seen it yet because you haven't done anything big. And I'm not saying that to be critical, but you haven't stood on a stage with a microphone and said true things. They burn. They go rah, like demons. And it only takes a few of them because so many people are cowards that everyone else just kneels.
So that's very vital to understanding Owen's point of view regarding Jordan Peterson. He's using his personal experience to inform his judgment about Jordan Peterson, and this is natural. This is what we all do, and this is, if you look at what Jordan Peterson talks about, and its basis in Jung and so forth. Much of what we do is sort of from our unconscious, as Paul Vanderklay likes to quote, height. the elephant and the rider, right? The rider and the elephant. Our consciousness is just a small part of this great beast that is the unconscious. And so what Owen is saying is that while Jordan professes belief in X, Y, and Z, like the principles of liberty and free speech and so forth, the principles of the West Christian tradition, he's acting in a far different manner, which is very interesting to look at it that way, because I don't see it. I'm trying to see it. I'm trying to see what Owen sees, but I just don't see it. And Owen's argument as to why we might not see it is because we have not experienced what Owen has experienced in Hollywood. He has seen corruption. He's seen people get corrupted. He's seen good people go bad. So from his analysis, this tweet from Jordan is the signal that he's gone bad, that he's been corrupted. Now, it's not the only signal. Owen makes sort of three criticisms that I can find that are his major gripes with Jordan Peterson. Number one, Jordan won't apologize. He says this 2 or 3 times in this video alone. And if only he would apologize, then his view of Jordan Peterson might improve. He might cut him some slack. He might look for some forgiveness and so forth. Number two, Jordan is not precise in his language, at least not as precise as he claims to have been. See, this is where Owen says he's a huckster. He's saying, "Oh, I'm so precise in my language. I think about every sentence 30 times. I think before I speak. This and that." Although when you do listen to Jordan on Joe Rogan's podcast, Jordan always said that he's afraid that something he will say, he's sort of going to step in it, will end the wave that he's riding, and he'll be brought back down to earth, so to speak. He's always been afraid of that. So anyway, so then he also says, so Jordan's not precise in his language. He's confusing on purpose. So when he talks about the belief in God and how he says, well, what do you mean? It depends on belief. It depends on what God believes and what you believe God is and so forth. He says that's just confusing you. He's making things more complicated than they need to be in order to con people. This is what Owen says, that Jordan is really a con man. He's a huckster. He's a fraud. And he's using language to muddy the waters, to make them seem deep, as Nietzsche says. And the third point that Owen has against Jordan is now wearing expensive suits. He says this a couple of times in this video alone. The implication being, from what I can tell, if you want to look at it in a symbolic way, Jordan has changed his skin like a snake. He is being corrupted by Hollywood, and this new skin is shinier than the old skin, and it's flashy, it's colorful, and now he's this viper that is has all kinds of neon colors to it to warn other animals that it's poisonous, right? And so this is what Owen sees. He's seeing this very visually, and I want to bring in Scott Adams just tangentially here. Scott Adams sort of talks about stuff that Jonathan Haidt talks about, but on a less scientific level. He talks about persuasion and how that we're actually not as rational as we like to think. We're actually very irrational in our, quote, thinking. This is something that Jordan Peterson also writes about and talks about in a more scientific and mythological way. But if you're familiar with Scott Adams, I think he's good at speaking plainly about what this principle is, what's actually happening with human beings. And Owen would like to think that he's a rational actor and that he's making arguments and he has evidence to back up his points, but he really doesn't. And I don't say this to belittle Owen, and I'm not trying to make an argument here myself. I'm rather painting a picture for you, and if you can see the picture, then I've painted it well enough for you to see it. And if you can't, maybe you don't have eyes to see it. But I'm going to do my best to make it clear for you. And I'm trying, again, in the line of Scott Adams, I'm not trying necessarily to persuade. I'm just trying to present what I see to you. So those are the 3 points that I've outlined. And I think I'm going to bring in N.T. Wright, because he does speak, oddly enough, a little bit about social pressures and the mob mentality at universities and how they are used to pressure people into believing just the status quo and so forth. And so he's going to jump in here a little bit about the Bible and mobs and so forth.
But so the Bible is not a book about all the people who got it right who we have to copy. It's about a lot of people who got it badly wrong, from which God astonishingly has rescued us. So that too needs to be factored into the conversation. But out of all of this, I think I want to say, as with the intellectual problems, don't be swept off your feet by the sudden powerful pressure which says, this is the way we're all going, and if you don't step into line, we're going to say rude things about you, or we're going to go on blog sites and rubbish you, or whatever. There's a lot of bullying in all directions on this one, and that's not a good way to be. And again, part of the vocation of a university, I think, ought to be that it's a place where you can actually discuss the issues, and if you're not convinced by something, don't feel you have to agree, whichever way it is, just because these are friends who kind of have some sort of power over you. Be prepared to put the issue on the shelf, walk around it, if you're a Christian, pray about it, and wait and see. And of course, in the middle of it, read the Bible, not as a railway timetable to tell you which train to get on and off when. You know, the Bible is not like that. The Bible is this huge, great cosmic story into which we're invited to come and find our role, not just as recipients, but actually as actors. And when the Bible forms you like that, then this is part of that character formation. So I've walked right round the issue, which I think, well, not right round some bits of the issue, but it seems to me that in a community like this, and especially with people, you know, so I've been a student pastor for some of my pastoral ministry, and there's not much, I think, that hasn't come through my office door at some point or another. I've faced most of the issues as real issues with real people sitting in my room, often in tears, trying to figure out where their lives are. So I'm not saying this as a theoretician only, but I really do want to say on this, be prepared to wait, be patient, be prepared to learn wisdom, which can be difficult and hard, and be prepared to be guided. Because what you do with yourself, what you do with your body, actually matters enormously. There is no such thing as casual sex.
So I think there's a lot of wise words there from N.T. Wright, and he did reference some earlier concepts that he was talking about, and I'm going to try to explain it to you to give you some more clarity. He talked about a difficult time in his life in which he actually, quote, turned many corners, and he had a lot of problems that he was thinking about that he had no answers for. And so he said he had sort of a shelf in his mind that he put these problematic things, these questions on. He put them on the shelf, and so he's talking about at the end here, giving yourself time, having patience, and allowing yourself to think about those items on the shelf unhurriedly. And don't be fast to judgment, and pray about it, and allow the things to sort of sit there, and don't let those things reshape how you see everything else. It's very, very important. And if you're into Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary, there's actually part of the way the brain works in some degree on some matters is that you can't actually be thinking about the thing in order to solve it. So an interesting phenomenon is you're trying to remember something. Let's say an actor's name. That's often the case for me when I'm trying to describe a movie to someone. I can't remember the name of the actor, so you can try to access that name in your mind, and it's never going to happen. If you move on to another topic, and so you relax the mind and you're just not trying to access it, it'll come to you. There is some biological mechanism behind that he's describing here in a non-medical, non-scientific way, by creating that shelf, putting the items on that shelf in your mind and letting it sit there. Now, this could be good advice for Jordan Peterson. Instead of thinking out loud about an insoluble problem, instead of tweeting about it, he needs to create that shelf in his mind and just put it there. I'm sure he does this for other things, but I would just say, if I'm going to hand criticism both ways here to Owen, and I would put some to Jordan, don't tweet about that stuff. It's funny because I side with Owen on much the way he thinks about this tweet, and about Jordan in this fashion, but I still don't ultimately agree with Owen. I think everything you see with him in this video and in other videos he does about Jordan, it's him trying to excise Jordan from his heart, from his mind, from his soul, and the impact Jordan had on him is still lingering. People ask him, well, did he throw 12 Rules for Life in the garbage? He goes, no, I'm not one to do that, and so forth. But I'm going to go back to Owen right now and a little bit more about him and his first point about how Jordan Peterson is perhaps corrupted and so forth. So because Owen says that he's seen corruption in Hollywood, he's seen this evil, he's seen good people turn bad, like I mentioned. He's done things that, quote, we haven't done. We haven't stood on stage and we haven't spoken truth to people, and then we haven't been enveloped by the angry mob like he has. He's had a very traumatic, in my opinion, a very traumatic occurrence in his life. This whole transition out of Hollywood with his family to upstate New York with his brother, and then further, sort of being run out of that town. Now, he chose to move, I think, for his brother's sake, but what happened there was just as traumatic, I think, as the whole movement out of Hollywood. And so, I really feel for Owen in that. And if you watch the first 20 minutes of this video, you'll get a sense of what that was like. So these are a couple of very traumatic events that Owen has experienced. And this is the evil from Hollywood that sort of has its tentacles in everywhere, even in upstate New York, in this small town around Saranac Lake. So that's how he's informing his judgment of Peterson. He sees the evil. He sees Peterson has been colored. His judgment of Peterson has been colored by his past experiences. And I think that's very important, where he's not necessarily making an argument. If anything, he's making an argument to authority, where he's the authority figure. He has the insider knowledge, and he's letting us know that his judgment is more correct about Peterson than our own. So I'm just looking at my notes so his judgment is colored by his experiences, as is ours. I want to mention that my own experiences color my judgments as well. And this is something people on the right, like Stefan Molyneux, don't want to necessarily acknowledge fully. They always say, oh, that's not an argument, or this, they want to go back to logic and reason. Well, that's Sam Harris's God, is logic and reason. You need more than that. That's just one half of the puzzle. Facts, reason, that sort of thing. That's certainly one half of the issue. But the other half is your actual life experience. These are the things the social justice types like to bring up, and we like to dismiss them. But it's actually a much more important. It's much more important as to how we come to our judgments than facts and reason. All right, so I want to compare what you see here with Owen to Jordan Peterson's performance on Bill Maher and then his infamous tweet. So the tweet sort of sent Owen off the edge and into murdering and aborting Jordan Peterson from his life. But how was the performance Jordan had on Bill Maher's show? Well, on Bill Maher's show, Jordan was hailed as a sort of right-wing hero for sticking a tough question to the liberal guest panel. How did they intend to deal with the rest of the country who voted for Trump if the Democrats regained power in the House and Senate? So what was their plan for healing the country? This was Jordan's aim here. There are people that you can't just dismiss as, what did Hillary call them? I don't even remember. This is where the unbearable started to emerge, because they sort of came out of that Hillary Clinton speech, that these are people that just have to be dismissed like garbage, but they're not. That's a whole half of the country that you have to contend with, and you have to bring healing to the country. You have to figure out a middle way. You can't just keep going further to one side, further to the left, and then further to the right, and then further to the left. You're going to end up in a hellscape eventually. So Jordan's issue was about healing the country. Or else, you might see actual violence erupting. And isn't that sort of prophetic in some ways? But anyway, so if you put this into context, the context of Jordan Peterson himself, and let's say his appearance on Bill Maher, you'll see that he's not really about a right wing anything. He's not a proponent of the right wing or conservatism necessarily. Like he said, he's had to explain many times to people who have a problem with his book that it's an antidote to chaos and so forth, that he's only addressing the issue that's of most concern right now. Chaos right now is concerning him. It's the SJWs in the university system corrupting the courses there that are of most concern to him, because that leaks out into the greater society. So he's really described himself as a classical British liberal, right? So he's more sort of libertarian than conservative or necessarily liberal. And don't forget where he comes from in Canada. They lean sort of to the left compared to Americans anyway, as a whole population. So their, quote, right wing would be sort of our center, if you want to look at it that way. So he's not interested necessarily in politics, and he's more interested in healing people. And this is why, you know, he's pushing his books, he's pushing his past and future authoring programs every chance he gets, because, you know, he's making money off of that, of course, but he's making money by helping people, which seems to be the best possible way of making money. And if you're Owen Benjamin and you're a capitalist and you believe that making money is a fine thing, and if you can make money actually helping people, well, isn't that great? Like, that's not a criticism that can come from Owen Benjamin. And he only tangentially approaches that criticism by saying he's wearing the expensive suits. That's a little bit of I wanted to put up a Bernie Sanders thing talking about why do you need so many deodorants? But I won't do that. I'll skip that. So now look at the tweet, the infamous tweet, in the context of all of that. So Jordan was trying to figure out a way to heal people. I think, as Brett Weinstein, he just said, like, they would need some kind of miraculous healer or something to that effect. And so Jordan responded, well, like, here's the way I think we can do it, to try to bring about the truth while still being considerate of those who have had personal experiences that were coloring their view of the situation, just as Owen is using his personal experiences to make judgments about Peterson and the whole tweet issue. Now, I don't agree with what Jordan said was a possible solution, or his putting it on Twitter. I think both of those things were wrong, just as Owen does. But I also realize that he's merely a human being, and, you know, we're all capable of making mistakes, certainly. And now Owen would say that, well, this mistake is not any ordinary mistake. So he claims two things when he says this. First, that this mistake is going against everything that Jordan has ever stood for. It's his central message of speaking the truth. And secondly, that Jordan was helping to condemn an innocent man by piling on the stones. First, he would have to know for a fact that Jordan was indeed lying in his tweet and in his explanations for the tweet. Does it sound like a lie or like thinking out loud? Is it a lie or trying to heal the nation? There are a whole bunch of women who have had bad experiences with drunk men in high school and college, and they are painting the Judge Kavanaugh, with those experiences. They're coloring him in. They're filling in the blanks from their life experience, just as Owen is coloring the character of Jordan Peterson with his own Hollywood experiences. He's seen people corrupted by Hollywood money, and so he's putting in his personal experience, and he's filling in the blanks, because he can't possibly know Jordan's motivations. He can't possibly read Jordan's mind. He can't possibly know if Jordan was actually lying about what he said. He's not a mind reader. And Scott Adams talks about this frequently, that avoid the people who think that they can read minds. It's always a mistake. So he can't dismiss those judgments of those women, that population of people who are coloring in the character of Kavanaugh, perhaps mistakenly. I believe it's a mistake, and I agree with Owen that I think the guy was probably innocent, and it certainly sets a bad precedent to have a mob demand justice, and for these accusations, a Supreme Court nominee has to step down. That, to me, sets a very bad cultural precedent, and I explained that in my first commentary video. But still, you have to consider, as this is what Jordan was doing, from the perspective of Jordan Peterson as a doctor, as someone who's trying to heal psychological wounds, he tried to go the route of King Solomon. So was Jordan Peterson going against Western tradition of that innocent until proven guilty, that kind of thing? And I think that's more of a legal thing. It's for individuals who are like a judge or a part of a jury. There you have to consider the person innocent until proven guilty. Certainly, but not as a private citizen. A private citizen from anywhere they can believe whatever they want about a person's guilt or innocence. Secondly, Jordan wasn't saying that the judge was guilty, but that there were enough people upset and convinced that he was after being confirmed. Stepping down would not be an admission of guilt, but a way of being like King Solomon again, of ordering the bisection of the baby so that the truth can come out and so that perhaps healing could take place. Now, I don't agree with that, but that's clearly, if you walk in Jordan Peterson's shoes, if you take his position, if you have any kind of empathy and can see the world through another person's eyes, that's what he was going after. That was his mission there. It was not some subversive thing that Owen likes to now paint it as. So, like I said, I think about speaking this, like as Jordan did, out into the Twitterverse, into the ears of his followers, was a crucial step in Jordan's argumentation for free speech, in that he received sudden feedback from his community about how much of a bad idea this actually was, despite the possible wisdom that he was trying to imbue it with. And so this is something, it's actually not something that is centrally going against what Jordan stood for, as Owen likes to claim. It's actually a great exemplar of what Jordan always stood for. It's speaking, even if what you're talking about is mistaken, if he was not lying, he was just putting forth an idea and then getting feedback from your community as a corrective measure. And this is not bowing down to a mob. Obviously, that's why we like Jordan Peterson. He does not bow down to a mob. That's how he rose to fame. He's not bowing down to a mob. It's listening to your community. Just as Owen would listen, I'm sure, if a majority of the bears said, "What are you doing?" And I think a lot of bears are saying to him, "What are you doing with this Jordan Peterson stuff? It seems like you're trying to have an abortion." Now circle back to the three primary criticisms. Firstly, Owen is confusing me with his recent ideas about Jordan Peterson apologizing. At first, he argued that Jordan Peterson was wrong for apologizing, and any kind of apology would only further cement his belief that Jordan was a fraud, because Jordan was the one who said, "Never apologize to a mob." Now Owen wants him to apologize. I won't say that Owen is being hypocritical here or intentionally confusing. Maybe I missed something. I'm human. I make mistakes too. Maybe I'm misinterpreting this. I'll just leave it as him being unclear here. It's really confusing to me, because in previous videos, as far as I can remember, he said Jordan would be a fraud if he apologized. And then when Jordan did his blog post, he goes, "See, he's a fraud. He's trying to apologize, and he's complicating matters with his speech. He's making things too complicated, whereas they should be just simple." So this brings me to Shapiro's video about assuming someone's intentions. And I have it here. I can't play it because I believe I'll get a copyright strike. But it's The Question of Motives, The Ben Shapiro Show, episode 645. And I actually watched it right after I deleted my previous 2-hour commentary on this Owen Benjamin video. And I thought, wow, how fortuitous. Ben Shapiro sort of is saying exactly what I was thinking, and I'm applying it to this, what I saw in Owen Benjamin's video here. So Shapiro was saying, lately we seem to assume the worst possible motives for someone who's acting, for someone who's on the other side of the political aisle, acting in some way. So whatever someone does, and if they oppose our political views, we seem to attribute to them the worst possible motives. He started talking about Megyn Kelly, I think, for some of that, and so forth. But I would like to apply it to Jordan Peterson. As soon as Jordan Peterson he crossed the political line in Owen's mind, he immediately imbued Jordan with the worst set of motives based on his personal experience with the Hollywood types. And what he keeps mentioning, CAA, that's the reps that Jordan now has professionally representing him in the commercial world. So he has this insider knowledge, he has this personal experience which informs him that he could see that Jordan has changed his clothes, has changed his skin, he's a different man, he's corrupt. Now, I'm not ruling that out. To me, it seems like I'm a big fan of the show Frasier. It seems more like that Jordan is acting like Frasier whenever Frasier tried to get on TV or tried to bring his radio show national. He kind of got a little bit caught up in it, but in an innocent, fun way. Of course, the show was in part a comedy, so I thought it was hilarious. But I don't see Jordan yet as nefarious. Now, I'm open to the possibility, maybe someday I will come to the judgment that Jordan is being nefarious and he's trying to manipulate people. I just don't see it yet. And I think, Owen has a history of acting very extremely, very quickly. I think that's actually part of a personality disorder, and I don't want to diagnose Owen here just from this internet video. I just want to throw it out there that if you know anybody like that, it's part of a personality disorder. So like he called out Joe Rogan and then immediately apologized when Joe Rogan gave him a phone call and a talking to, and so forth. And this has happened many times with Owen over the past year. So I'm curious to see if this will ever turn around, if Jordan would ever want to talk to Owen and see, if a resolution could be reached. I'd be curious if Owen would then apologize and so forth. So now to Owen's second major point. Owen said that Jordan confuses people with language, that things don't depend on what the meaning of depend is. That's one of the almost direct quotes from this video. It's all much simpler than that, you see. Even the God question is something he seems to waffle on, don't you know, making it more confusing and complicated in order to con people, at least according to Owen. But I find this particularly interesting and awful from a person like Owen, whose first podcast, Why Didn't They Laugh?, was all about dissecting jokes. And as he has said many times before, jokes depend on people getting it. And there are layers to jokes. To the best jokes the best jokes seem to have at least 3 layers. There's a layer a surface level that everybody gets. So everybody in the room can sort of laugh. They get something about it. And then fewer and fewer people get the next layer. And you keep going down and down into the depths of the joke until the very core is only really truly understood by a select few. But it's usually a deep, profound meaning that can actually change the way you look at the world. Humor is, I think, part of an art form. And so through the lens of the joke, you can change the way you look at the world, and it can change the way the world works. That's why I think Owen, in part, is very important in the big picture of things, because he's a comedian who's been ostracized and mobbed, and he's sort of the lone voice in the wilderness for a lot of other people. And that's why I think changing his mind on this would be wonderful, but I'm not here to do that. He'll probably never see this. So language and jokes can take many forms, from the literalness of the language being part of the humor, like that's why it's funny, because it's so literal. You're taking things to an extreme literal level, to the metaphorical or even the exaggerated. So he's keenly aware of the layers and complexity of language as it pertains to humor, as it is his job to craft a joke. He knows all about language, particularly with his mother being a professor of, what does she teach? It's some kind of literature, right? So she's into literature, the mythology that Jordan's into. So she knows all about that metaphorical stuff. And his father was a professor of rhetoric. So there's another aspect of language that Owen's very intimately familiar, given his past experience, his upbringing by 2 professors who dealt highly in language and the complexities of language. And now here, Owen's professional career is this construction of the joke out of language, out of words. He knows what's complicated in language, and he knows language is complicated. And that's part of a comedian. Sometimes the comedian has to take a complex subject and simplify it for an audience to get it. So he knows all about this. So doesn't he think that religion, theology, thousands of years of philosophy and history, all expressed in different languages across time by various people and various cultures, wouldn't that be also complicated? Or is that just simple? That's just the table is red, the door is green, the window is open. Right? Is that all we're talking about? Declarative sentences like that? So he says the Bible should be understood plainly. But what does he make of the book of Jonah? And N.T. Wright gets into this in that video. Or the parables of Jesus. Were they lies? Because Jesus, didn't really know about a prodigal son. He didn't have a name for these people. They were parables. They're stories. They're ways to get the idea across to the audience that you're talking to. So this is the rationalist trap of scriptural authority. And I actually want to play N.T. Wright on this idea of the rationalist trap of scriptural authority. I think it might be interesting to the Paul Vanderklay crowd, or even to any Owen Benjamin fans who are interested in the Bible and Christianity, to hear N.T. Wright talk about this kind of scriptural trap.
In order, because the question of the authority of Scripture is difficult for us, because in the modern world we are so much the heirs of the Enlightenment, but also of rationalism, that when people say the phrase authority of Scripture, what they easily find themselves meaning, even if they didn't quite intend to, is that Scripture is the sort of book in which you can look up the true answers to certain key questions, like either a railway timetable or an encyclopedia or something like that. And there are many Christians who've tried to use the Bible that way, where every single bit of the Bible is simply information coming from God to us, so we can open it anywhere, whether it's Leviticus or the Gospel of Luke or the book of Revelation, and just find something which will be authoritative for us today. And then we quickly run into a problem, that there are several passages in the New Testament which seriously relativize material in the Old Testament. So that, for instance, the Sabbath commandment in the Old Testament is absolutely mandatory and insisted on. The Sabbath commandment in the New Testament has been basically set aside. Why? How did that happen? Was it because the Jews were legalists and we Christians aren't legalists? Actually, no, it's nothing whatever to do with that. Or take the issue of, well, I mentioned circumcision. Paul deals with that in Galatians. That was mandatory for the people of God in the Old Testament, not in the New. Why? There are good reasons for that, and the church has not always grappled with them. Or take the issue of animal sacrifice. Mandatory in the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus and so on, full of it. The letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament says that has stopped with the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's awesome. That means when you look up in Leviticus all sorts of things which it says, this is how you must do it, the New Testament says, no, we're not doing that anymore. Now, therefore, when you look at it in that rationalistic fashion, then people say, oh, well, so the Bible's just full of contradictions and we can't trust it at all. That's the kind of negative side of the rationalistic misuse, if you like, of Scripture. Scripture is not a book like that at all. Scripture is a story. And the phrase, the authority of Scripture, is a dangerous shorthand. It's fine if you know what it's shorthand for, but if you don't, then it will lead you into that rationalist trap, and then you'll find that it doesn't quite work, and then, because of other pressures, you'll be tempted to give it up altogether. Scripture is a narrative, and the key thing, and this is, I've got a little book on with this title, Scripture and the Authority of God. According to Scripture, God and God alone has authority. That is to say, God has authority which he delegates to Jesus. At the end of Matthew's Gospel, the risen Jesus does not say, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to the books you people are going to go and write. No, he says, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. So if we use the phrase authority of Scripture as a shorthand, what we must mean by that, if we're talking sense, is that this is God's authority in Jesus, somehow operative through the Bible. Now that's a rather different thing. This doesn't mean that you can naively appeal to God over the head of Scripture, as it were, as though, well, I know God doesn't really want me to do this. So even though Scripture says, that would be a very naive and foolish thing to try to do. But what it means is this: that the narrative of Scripture is a narrative about God, God's creation, God's people, and God's purposes. It's the narrative that leads ultimately to new creation. And when we talk about the authority of Scripture, what I think we should mean is something much more dynamic than simply a book in which we can go and look up right answers to questions that we might have. The Scripture is full of good answers to good questions, and we can use it like that, but it's much bigger and more interesting than that. It's a narrative in which we are invited, as I said before, to become actors. We are invited to become part of God's project of new creation. And when you read it as a story, you discover that, like a play, it has certain acts. And certain things happen in the earlier acts, which, surprise, surprise, don't happen in the later acts. Because, if you went to the theatre and saw a Shakespeare play, and they simply in Act 5 repeated all the speeches they'd said in Acts 2 or 3, you'd think something's gone horribly wrong with this play. The actors have just miscued hopelessly, because the thing develops. And in the same way, the story, which is the scriptural narrative, which I take as authoritative in this sense, it is our story. We live in it, but we are not actors in the act which is when Israel was wandering through the wilderness, or under Kings David and Solomon, or whatever, because the story has moved on, and in Jesus an entirely new act has been launched, and we are actors within that act, and we read the earlier acts not to find an exact description of what we ought to do, but to find the backstory of how we got to where we are, so that we can then move forward. And the point of now acting within the authority of Scripture, or within God's authority through Scripture, is more about learning what the whole story is, so that we understand where the narrative ought to be going now, and can be wise, obedient, spirit-led people in doing that. And so we study the earlier acts in order to act in character, not necessarily in order to repeat the same speeches. So once you demystify the idea of authority of Scripture from that rationalist trap, and see it as what it is, this huge, great, well, I was going to say open-ended narrative. It's not open-ended, because the end is quite clear. It's the joining together of heaven and earth. Heaven and earth are made for one another. We don't escape earth in order to go to heaven. Heaven and earth come together. So we know that that's where the story's going. And if we act at the moment in a way which denies that ending, then we are like an actor suddenly using speeches from Hamlet in the fifth act of Macbeth, or vice versa. And that is really going to confuse everybody, including the prompter. So let's just be wise and grown up about how we use it. So that's about the meaning of authority of Scripture. Now, the question of the historical authenticity of the events recorded in Scripture often gets muddled up with that, because when people start with the rationalistic account of Scripture's authority, they assume this means that every single thing that Scripture says happened exactly as it says. And then you come to the book of Jonah and you say, well, did Jonah really get swallowed by a whale? Or was this a wonderful, maybe 4th century BC folk tale, which actually makes some very important theological points? And you see, here's the question of genre. When Jesus told the parable about the father who had 2 sons, and one went off and wasted his money and came back, and the father welcomed him back, it's a matter of genre that we know that the wrong question to ask is, what was the name of the farmer? Or where in Galilee was that farm? This is a parable. Everybody knew it was a parable. Does that mean Jesus was telling lies? No, of course not. It means Jesus was making up fictitious stories which resonated in the culture and broke open the way people thought about God and the world and themselves. Fine. Maybe there are some books, maybe Jonah is like that, maybe probably not Ruth, but maybe whole chunks of the Old Testament might be in principle like that. Maybe Genesis 1 and 2 are what they are, which are 2 apparently incompatible creation accounts, because they're both pointing from different angles into a space beyond them both, where something is true for which we just don't have words, and these 2 signposts into this unsayable third thing are the best we can do. And maybe that's part of the humility of reading Scripture, to be prepared to be pointed into the unknown, rather than to say, this gives us simply a factual account. But then when we come to the Gospels and we come to the resurrection of Jesus, there is no question at all that all the early Christians for whom we have any evidence really did believe that 3 days after Jesus was brutally crucified, executed, he was physically alive, leaving an empty tomb behind him, but that his body had been changed, had been transformed. It wasn't a resuscitation. He didn't just come back into exactly the same sort of existence as before. And this causes all sorts of confusion, which I've tried to write about and lay out in the various books that I've written on this, and articles and so on. And obviously this is bizarre, because they knew as well as we do that this does not happen. C.S. Lewis nailed this myth a while ago, like 50 years ago, when he pointed out people sometimes today say, oh, well, back then they didn't know the laws of nature. So, of course, they were ready for all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Whereas we now have more. I once did a television interview with a skeptical German professor who insisted angrily that we know that the body of Jesus has molded in the tomb. He thumped the table. I said, how do you know that? He said, I have 200 years of scientific historiography on my side. I said, wait a minute. It didn't take Voltaire and Rousseau and Darwin and co. to tell us that dead people stay dead. I mean, Socrates knew that. Homer knew that. This is, it's like, Lewis has this wonderful line where he says the reason that Joseph was worried about Mary's pregnancy was not because he didn't know where babies came from, but because he did. They were not stupid. So when we then look at the rise of early Christianity, we have to say they knew as well as we do that this is the most bizarre, unexpected, dramatically extraordinary thing that could possibly have happened. And yet they go on saying that it did. And Ed Sanders, who used to teach at Duke, he's now emeritus, who is not a devout Christian. I think Ed would be happy for me to say he's kind of on the liberal spectrum somewhere. I think he may be a believer, but he's certainly on the more liberal end of the spectrum. Ed says in one of his books, it looks as though they were very much trying to describe an event for which they knew they didn't have very good language. It seems to me that's exactly what's going on. They are still in shock about this. But all the evidence is that something dramatic must have happened because, face it, we've got evidence for a dozen or more other messianic or popular prophetic movements in Judaism within 100 years either side of Jesus. Routinely, they end with the death of the founder, the violent death of the founder. When that happens, the followers, assuming they're not killed as well, have a choice. Either you give up the movement or you get another leader. Going around saying he's been raised from the dead just isn't an option. These are hard-headed people who want revolution, who want God to do the new thing they've been waiting for. And to say, oh, he's been raised from the dead, and mean by that, I've got this nice feeling in my heart after all. Come on, get real. This is that's actually a very modern Western way of looking at it. So for me, I cannot historically explain the rise of Christianity without the resurrection of Jesus. And I haven't made the argument here, I've just sketched it, and it needs to be made more fully. But I believe that, when I read the Bible, I say to myself, it looks as though it's really saying this and this and this. Then as a historian, I say to myself, well, my goodness, does that make sense in the first century? And we go on round that track, history and faith, history and faith. In the great Christian tradition, Jesus is both fully divine and fully human. And without history and without faith, you're only getting one part of him. And we need to have that marriage. Your culture, more than mine, tends to pull those apart. And
so that's what, in part, Jordan is reacting to, is the pulling apart of faith and history, of myth and science, and you see that right in the first few pages of Maps of Meaning. If you follow my Maps of Meaning, Meaning Mondays, it's every page, right, basically, so far that I've done. And if you want to throw in again the lens of Ian McGilchrist, you're going to have faith as right hemisphere. It's open-ended. It can't be pinned down. Once it is pinned down, it's destroyed. And left hemisphere is the history part. It's looking at the details. What did first century Jews believe? What can we know that they knew? What would make sense? And then you fit in your faith into this. And like you said, it's sort of a circular thing where there's faith and history, and you're using both parts of your brain, both hemispheres, to establish a judgment and to establish a worldview. So is Jordan making things more complicated than they need to be, or is he trying to express something rather complicated to a general audience who is largely unfamiliar with many of the philosophical, theological, anthropological, and psychological details that have accrued over the past 2,000 years of men thinking about these issues and trying to express what they think? Now, that's a rhetorical question, but I'm going to answer it. Of course, Jordan isn't trying to make things more complicated. He's trying to simplify them as best he can to a general audience who doesn't know anything about these topics, but who are then inspired to go look into it. Lastly, regarding the expensive suits. So this is the last criticism I think Owen keeps bringing up against Jordan. It's almost a leftist smear that, oh, he has money, look at him, he's bad now. But I'm not going to say that's where Owen's coming from, because it wouldn't fit the context of Owen Benjamin. If I'm going to look at the, let's say I'm saying, Owen, look at the context of Jordan Peterson. How do you think a leftist underhanded deception tactic is going to fit into the context of Jordan Peterson? It doesn't make any sense. At least not from where I'm standing, at least not from what I know right now. Now, Owen is claiming secret knowledge, the knowledge of the insider, the knowledge of his personal experience in Hollywood. But if I'm going to judge Owen fairly, I can't say that in the context of Owen Benjamin, from what I know, that him making a leftist critique at Jordan saying, oh, look at him, he's got money now, look at the way he's behaving, doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't think it's coming from this leftist envy perspective. I think this is explained simply enough by what Jordan has actually said about this in the past. He said, you should present yourself nicely if you're going to be doing important things for people, like going to a job interview, or dress up nicely, present yourself nicely when you're going to speak to people in a crowd. Jordan has people paying hundreds of dollars to hear him talk, and for him to come in Cheeto-stained jogging clothes, all sweaty, would be insulting to the audience, don't you think? Instead, he dresses up as nicely as he can to present himself the best he can to the audience to show respect for them. That's what he said in his own words. I think that's actually a common understanding of why people dress up. It's not just for themselves, it's for the people around them. So that's really the simplest explanation that I can have regarding to, oh, he's wearing expensive suits now criticism. And I'm not coloring that with the worst motivations, as Ben Shapiro says, that we tend to do now, just because someone crosses our political boundaries. I'm trying to refrain from that. And I think Owen is falling into that trap. And that's why I'm putting this out here to my community that I think is, part of Owen's community. I'm part of Owen's, I'm part of Paul Vanderglaze, I'm part of Jordan Peterson's community. And because I'm a node in this network, I want to give some feedback. And I hope if you all find this valuable in any way, that you would pass this along to other people in that community that you think might be interested in this. And give the video a like and a comment if you have some strong feelings about it, or you want to add your 2 cents. I'd be happy to hear it. And share the video and subscribe if you're not a subscriber. Thank you.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.